birds is a big topic, so I'm super pleased that everybody has come, especially on a nice snowy evening. And I'd like to thank Dave Strong, actually, for suggesting that I might touch base with his son, Allan, to be a speaker. And I'm so pleased that that's possible. So aren't we all looking forward to once again being out in the field, seeing some of our favorite grassland birds like bobolinks and those hard to identify sparrows. But sometimes we worry about how birds might be, especially bobolinks might be lost to mowing when it's inappropriate. Well, I think tonight's speaker is going to shed some light on this problem and some new ways to address it. Allan Strong is a professor in the Rubenstein School of Environmental and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. His research focuses on avian ecology and the factors that influence habitat quality. He has taught at the University of Vermont since 1999 after receiving his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Tulane University. He grew up in Rochester, and he comes back regularly to visit his dad, who is a longtime RBA member, and to bird around here. And I had the pleasure of being with Allan and Kinsey Whittam last year on a bird trek, and it was lots of fun. So please welcome Allan Strong. Allan, take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Jean. And I appreciate the invitation, and great to be back in Rochester, and great to see so many familiar faces. Lots of you I've birded with in the past, or like Bob have been, and Dominic have been birding mentors to me over the years. Taken me as a high school student in your car before I had my driver's license to go look for unusual birds out at the lake. So great to be back, and great to spend some time with all of you. So I will go ahead and jump in here. And I thought I would kind of start by setting the scene and taking you out to a grassland. It's daybreak, early June. You're driving through some rolling hay fields south of the city, and you pull over to the side of the road to take a picture of the beautiful pink sunrise. The sun comes up a little bit higher. You start to see the dew glistening off the seed heads of the rye and the fescue, the timothy, the panic grass. And all of a sudden you hear a familiar sound. And sure enough, it's the wild, rollicking sound of the bobolink. You turn around and see a male bobolink flying across the field. His crazy backwards tuxedo catches the sun as he flies over the hayfield. He lands in the grass surrounded by a buttercup and clover that are in full flower at this time of year. His attention's focused on the ground. You wonder if there's a nest nearby. And as he takes flight again, you catch sight of the barn in the background and realize the deep connections between bobolinks and our agricultural heritage. We cleared our forest to plant crops for livestock, creating thousands of acres for habitat for grassland birds. And here's the female bobolink. Looks more like a big sparrow than a blackbird. She's built for camouflage. And she's the one who will incubate the eggs and do most of the brooding. Here, she's keeping an eye out for predators or researchers trying to find her nest. The eggs are well camouflaged. Bobolinks lay clutches of 4 to 7 eggs, and the female will incubate the egg for about 13 days. After hatching, the young will spend another about 10 days in the nest before they begin to explore their surroundings. Now, obviously, bobolinks aren't the only species of grassland birds that use these habitats. Savannah sparrows are one of the most common species of grassland birds in the East. Northern harriers, eastern meadowlarks, American kestrels are all species that are still at least moderately common. But species like this sedge wren, as well as the grasshopper sparrow and Henslow sparrow and upland sandpiper, are showing dramatic population declines. So although we've created lots of habitat for these grassland birds, the complex relationship between farming and grassland species creates challenges for maintaining robust, viable populations of these species. And this relationship is going to be the focus of my talk this evening. So a lot of the work that I've been doing in the Champlain Valley of Vermont has really been focused on two species that I'll spend most of my time talking about, bobolinks and Savannah sparrows. Our overarching goal has really been trying to develop practices, agricultural practices that are compatible both with the ecological requirements of these birds, as well as maintaining economic benefits for landowners. And we know that the reason these birds are here is because of this agricultural heritage that we have. So the challenge, the biggest constraint, is that the grass-based forage crops that most farmers are using for dairy cows, even for horses and beef cows, really have limited value for agricultural producers when they're cut late in the nesting season. And that's because of this low protein content. So if you cut early, essentially the hay is really high in protein. As the season goes on, the protein content itself doesn't decline, but the grasses become much more heavily, the percentage of structural carbohydrates increases. So it's just not as good, especially if you're trying to produce milk. It's just not as good for these, for the dairy industry. So in the Northeast, and these were some data that we collected by surveying dairy farmers, a lot of the problems that we're facing are, one, we're just losing grassland habitat because farms are being converted into forest. People are just abandoning their fields. Second is that the intensity of management has really changed over the last 30 years. Number one, farmers are cutting earlier in spring. And secondly, they're harvesting 2 to 3 times per year, whereas historically, oftentimes that first cut might not have been until the end of June or early July. And maybe there'd be a second cut before the frost or the snow came. Now 2 to 3 and sometimes even 4 cuts per year is the norm. So where I do my work is this, this little asterisk down here. I'm on the Vermont side of the Champlain Valley, and we're actually in the same bird conservation region as Rochester is, BCR, Bird Conservation Region 13. And our particular study area, the blue over on the left side is Lake Champlain, and this black is all the agricultural land in the 4 counties that are closest to Lake Champlain. And as you look at this, it looks like there's a lot of grassland there, but Vermont's agricultural producers are generally fairly small. So on average, I mean, I think we have something like 30,000 individual patches of grassland, but on average, the size is only 10 acres. So we've got lots of habitat out there, but a lot of it is small, which creates some challenges for management. So as has been mentioned, and I think a lot of you know, is that grassland songbirds are showing the steepest population decline of really any guild of bird species. And as you look across this figure, it's really kind of a sobering tale. Henslow sparrows declining at 11% per year, and this is in our bird conservation region, BCR 13. Grasshopper sparrows and meadowlarks at over 4% per year, Savannah sparrows, bobolinks, and upland sandpipers declining 3 to 4% per year, and sedge wrens a little less than that. So all of these species, none of these species are doing particularly well. And again, it has to do with overall loss of habitat as well as increased management intensity on those remaining lands. So just in case you're not familiar with bobolinks, I wanted to give you this little graphic of some work that one of my colleagues has done, putting on transmitters. Essentially, these are they're geolocators, which essentially measure whether it's light or dark. And so in essence, what happens is, you know, when sunrise and sunset is, as well as having length of day, and that enables you to collect those data and estimate latitude and longitude. And it really shows this, you know, tremendous migratory pattern of the bobolink. So this is just one example of one bird, and you can see its fall migration is the brown line, and you can see the bird takes off and actually does fly over open ocean to the Caribbean, ends up in the Greater Antilles, jumps across to Venezuela. And what's really interesting is they spend about a month in Venezuela before they continue down into Brazil, Paraguay, Bolivia. And then again, coming back up, they take their time, especially here in Venezuela, Colombia, before they jump off and come back to the breeding grounds. And so just an amazingly remarkable long distance journey for these birds on an annual basis. And one of the challenges that that this long journey means for these birds is that they have a very short breeding season. And so the fact that they're spending a lot of their time on the wintering grounds or in migration means they don't have the opportunity to raise two broods. They will re-nest if their first nest fails, but they rarely have the opportunity to raise a second brood. So a 20,000 kilometer round trip per year is pretty impressive for you know, a small bird that's, you know, just yay big. So in a nutshell, to kind of show you the phenology of what happens, this is sort of the typical timeline for a bobolink. So peak arrival in our study area is probably around mid-May. They begin incubating. Most of the birds are incubating eggs here in late May and early June. And then we've got fledging that happens here in about the third week of June is really when that peaks. And so if we take the first day of the typical hay harvest in our neck of the woods is really around Memorial Day weekend. You can see that that's during peak incubation. And oftentimes for the most intensive fields, the next cut happens about 5 weeks later. And so you can see that this time period from the 1st of June till maybe the 10th of July is just not enough time for those birds to actually be able to re-nest. And so literally they may make a bad choice when they first arrive on the breeding grounds, and then oftentimes end up making a bad second choice because of a field that ends up getting cut a little bit later on. So it's challenging. It's a tough life for these grassland birds, especially in an intensively managed landscape. So the work that we've been doing has really been pretty standard demographic work. We do our best to catch all of the bobolinks and Savannah sparrows that nest on our fields. You can see one of my graduate students here with a mist net extracting a female bobolink. We use standard colored leg bands. So you've got the USGS aluminum band and then 3 colored leg bands that enable us to identify those birds without needing to go back and recapture them. Here's one of these males in the field with his showing off his jewelry. And then we do our best to find all the nests and monitor how well those birds do. And it's, you know, pretty standard work for understanding productivity and survival of a songbird. And it's just sort of brute force in many ways. So the way that we've really tried to frame this is look at what we call treatments, which are basically the main agricultural practices that occur in the Champlain Valley. And so there are 4 primary ways that fields are managed. So we've got early cut fields, which are the, sort of classic intensive dairy farms where they're cutting usually in late May to early June and 5 weeks thereafter. We have some producers who don't need quite that same high level of forage, high level of protein content in their forage. So these are what we call middle cut. These are mostly for beef cattle and horse, and they're typically cut around the middle of June, something along those lines. So unfortunately, it's still not good enough to get a large percentage of fledglings out of the nest, but it still does allow some time for birds to fledge. We also have pasture, and for the most part, we've been studying rotationally grazed pasture, where a farmer will divide their field into paddocks and they'll move animals from one paddock to another, a certain, sort of farm specific like height that they're looking for in terms of how far they'll graze the grass down to. And then finally, we do have a fair number of folks who, we might call hobby farmers, gentleman farmers, where they don't actually need any sort of forage or any sort of income from their field. They just like to keep it open. And that's sort of, again, the legacy of that agricultural heritage. So these are the treatments that we've basically used to try to understand how grassland birds are responding to agriculture in the Champlain Valley. And to show this in terms of a little bit of some of the temporal variation, these graphs here, and I think this will make sense as I go along, show in purple, this line is the minimum percentage of hay fields that are cut in a particular year by the 4th of July. And in yellow, this is the maximum number of fields that are cut. And essentially, this is weather dependent. So that purple line represents a really wet year where it was very challenging for farmers to get out and get their equipment out in the fields and cut their hay. Whereas this yellow line is essentially a great year, the weather's nice, grass is growing well, and the farmers are able to get out and cut whenever they want. And so the difference between those two lines is essentially the sort of the percentage of the Champlain Valley that's cut at any given time. And we can overlay on top of that the phenology of bobolinks. And so this blue line now shows the proportion, the cumulative percentage of bobolinks that are fledged at any given time of the year. And so you can see what happens is, nothing really until mid-June. Then you get a really nice spike that goes until, let's say maybe the 10th of July, and then it kind of starts to level off. And so when you start to put these two graphs together, you can see that as much as 22 to 54% of our total study area, the Champlain Valley, is cut by the time those first young are fledging. So when you basically say we're taking a quarter to half of the habitat out of production, it's really challenging to have a stable population. And so this is really the challenge that we're facing when we're thinking about managing for grassland birds. So on a positive note, this is the data that shows how well these birds do based on their productivity, their birth rates, in these 4 different treatments. So now across this x-axis in the bottom, we have on the left, the early hayed fields, the rotationally grazed fields, the middle hayed fields, and the late hayed fields. And the data are blue for bobolinks, and then the purple color is Savannah sparrows. And the numbers on top of each of these bars is the number of young that are produced per female per nest on those treatments. And so you can see in these early hayed fields, essentially nothing for bobolinks. Savannah sparrows actually do have some productivity. Savannah sparrows are really interesting. In fact, The natural history of these two species is really interesting with respect to haying. When a field is cut, 100% of the bobolinks leave, and some bobolinks might come back and try to re-nest on those fields, but the birds that do are totally different from the ones that were nesting there when the field was cut. Savannah sparrows, on the other hand, are kind of like the Energizer Bunny. They just, I mean, they keep trying and trying and trying, and we've had instances where a field has been cut, and literally 2 days later, we found a nest with eggs, maybe like 5 meters away from where that first nest was. So even though, their habitat looks totally different, those birds keep trying. So Savannah sparrows, and that shows up in terms of the way that their populations respond to agricultural management. Savannah sparrows are doing much better than bobolinks and meadowlarks because they're just so persistent. So you see a little bit better here, 1.5 to 2 young per female in the graze fields. It gets quite a bit better when we start to go to these middle hayed fields. And then we see the best response when you just leave the fields alone over the course of the breeding season. So maybe no surprise there, but it does show just how dramatic the difference is in terms of how these different management treatments affect the quality of the habitat for these species. So this is some work that we started to do trying to think about, are there any options for us to think about ways that we could still get farmers that important first cut, that high protein cut, and not, totally put them out of business? And what we started thinking about was saying, okay, well, if the first cut has to be around the 1st of June, what happens if we actually delayed the second cut? And so we started working with a bunch of farmers to say, what if we said, let's delay the second cut? So you get that high quality first cut around Memorial Day, and then we'll go 65 days, which gives essentially enough time to put incubation and fledging and still have birds be well developed enough to escape a tractor after they get out of the nest. And this has actually been something that's been fairly successful. So we've actually been able to get some farmers to take on this, this kind of different approach. And for them, the key is in that second cut, they don't have as high quality, but they've got a lot more quantity of hay, and they oftentimes are using it for different purposes. So they're not using it for milking cows anymore, but sometimes for young cows or heifers or for dry cows. And so thinking about alternative uses for hay that's not quite as high quality can be really helpful. And so this is something that we've at least been able to get folks to use in the Champlain Valley. Oh yeah, and this is just a graph showing that they actually do equally well in this delayed second cut program. So, excuse me, like I showed you before, here's early cut. They have a clutch size 3 to 4 eggs, but no young are fledged. If we take that classic approach, let's just delay cutting, the birds are laying about 5 eggs and fledging about 3.5 young. If we do this delayed second cut, we're getting, again, a little bit smaller clutch size. We know these are second clutches for these birds, so they probably don't quite have the energy reserves, but they're still fledging about 3 young. So it's actually been really, it's worked really well for the birds as well. It's interesting, again, the fact that it is a totally different population of bobolinks that come in though. So the field is cut, and then these are presumably birds whose nests have been destroyed on other fields come back in and recolonize that field. So it's really, it's an interesting, sort of ecological phenomenon as well to think about, where are these birds dispersing from, where are they going to? And in this particular case, coming to a cut field is actually a good choice. So what we've been working on over the last few years is something that we've been thinking about in terms of the idea of payment for ecosystem services. And really the question we've been trying to ask is whether or not there's sufficient interest in bobolink conservation that the public might actually pay farmers or landowners to undertake bird-friendly management practices. And this is something we've called the Bobolink Project. It's been started out as a collaboration between the University of Vermont, University of Vermont Extension, and University of Connecticut. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the story now, or a little later, but it's been taken over by some of the local Audubon chapters or state Audubon chapters. And so tell you a little bit more about it. So in terms of thinking about these ecosystem services, we generally characterize these as things that nature provides to all humans for free. And we can characterize these in a lot of different ways. We often think about services that might regulate certain ecological processes. Oftentimes we think about this as maybe wetlands or, pollinators, tree planting that regulates climate, different ways to cycle nutrients. Provisioning services are ones we often think about a lot because that's what provides our fuel and our food and our fiber. Information services, some of the things that we value in terms of the way in which we use natural resources, perhaps in a non-consumptive way. And then what we're really talking about here for bobolinks are what we call supporting services. So habitat for birds, refugia, things that support biodiversity. So what we did is we went out to farmers across the Champlain Valley. Although the first year, I'll say it was kind of a door-to-door type of thing. I literally was going from farmer to farmer and knocking on doors and trying to see if they'd be interested. But the criteria for including a field in the Bobolink Project was, we started out with 10 acres. In 2019, we upped that to 2019 acres. And we asked that those fields be in an agriculturally dominated landscape. And I know we sort of had this conversation at the beginning of the meeting where it's important, the landscape is important. And if you've got a 10-acre field that's surrounded by forest, it's really unlikely that you're going to get grassland birds there. But if it's a 10-acre field that's maybe surrounded by a hayfield that's surrounded by corn or soybeans, you're much more likely to get birds there, even though the surrounding landscape might not be perfect for them. That open feel of the landscape is really important. We also know these birds are edge sensitive, so oftentimes you won't find any nests until you get about 40 or 50 meters away from a tree line. So having those fields that are square and circular in shape is really important. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we gave the landowners two different options. So they could do the traditional late cut, or if they were trying to get that high quality first cut, they could cut before the 31st of May and then wait 65 days to do their second cut. So we went out to landowners and asked them essentially this question, which is, what would it take to incorporate bobolink production into your farm management system? So if you weren't raising milk, you weren't raising beef cows, but you were actually raising bobolinks, what would it actually take to include them into your business plan? And so the idea is then they start to think about, okay, what is the per acre cost that would enable them to essentially recover their opportunity costs of the land that they're going to take out of production, or they're going to lose production value of. And so we take those bids, all those per acre bids, and we order them from low to high. And we then at this, I guess I'm trying to think if I have that here. At the same time that we get those bids from landowners, we're going out to the public and fundraising. And we're asking people to say, would you be willing to pay for bobolinks in your neighborhood? And so when we get the money from donors, we then order those bids from the landowners from low to high, and we basically continue to pay each landowner until we run out of money. There's always some challenges when you're working with an economist, and my colleague at the University of Connecticut is an economist, and we use this uniform price reverse auction. And there's some economic logic for doing this, but basically what happens is if farmer A says, I need $10 per acre, and farmer B says, I need $20 per acre, and you've got enough to cover both of them, you're actually going to give them both $20 per acre. And there's some issues in terms of why people might either game the system or why they might essentially sort of free ride by saying, oh, I'm just going to bid $1 an acre and I'll take whatever I got. So the key is really asking people to say, what is it going to take? What do you need to make bobolinks part of your business model? So these are the results of our work over the past 7 years. And so a little bit complicated, but I'll walk you through these graphs. So the orange bars are the acres that we've enrolled. So you can see 2013, we enrolled 200 acres. And over the past 3 years, 18, 19, 20, we've gotten close to 1,000 acres enrolled. Haven't quite cracked the 1,000 acre mark yet, but we're getting close. The money raised, and this is in hundreds of dollars, has been anywhere from sort of 30,000 up to, again, kind of leveling off here at 50,000 a year. The interesting side of it, though, is those two graphs don't actually make sense until you look at this gray bar. And the gray bar is the price that we're paying per acre. And essentially what's happening as we're getting this word out to more and more farmers, our price per acre is coming down. So our assumption is we're creating competition in this market, and people are saying, you know, where they would have settled for $100, now they're realizing that maybe I could raise bobolinks for $75 an acre, or now we're paying pretty close to $50 an acre over the last couple of years. And we think, again, that's competition that's actually driving that. And then this yellow line is the number of bobolink pairs in the project. And you can see we've gone from, I don't know, about 125 or so in 2014, and then getting up to about 400 pairs of bobolinks on those fields that are enrolled now. So really nice in terms of seeing that this is actually working in terms of getting bobolinks out on these fields. And it's been, you know, pretty good in terms of other species. We have Savannah sparrows on all the fields, but we've had one sedge wren. We usually get 3 or 4 fields that have meadowlarks. We often have one field that supports a nesting harrier. And so it's been nice to see diversity of other species on these fields as well. One of the challenges is we seem to be limited by funding. So the supply, the number of farmers who are interested in getting enrolled in the project, is always greater than the demand, the buyers. So you can see enrolled is the orange on top, blue is the unenrolled. This year it went down somewhat. I don't really know if that's a COVID feature in terms of people just wanting to use their land in other ways, or us not getting the word out. But we'll see what happens in 2021. But right now, it's certainly, in terms of our donations, is limiting the amount of acres that we can actually enroll in the program. So where are we now? One of the things that has been amazing to me about this project, and I don't know, still continues to blow me away. And we often think about, you know, I don't know, wolves and polar bears and pandas as charismatic megafauna. Bobolinks are charismatic megafauna, or maybe charismatic microfauna. I mean, people love bobolinks, and I was just really surprised in terms of, one, getting landowners interested in conserving them, and two, getting donors interested in conserving grassland birds, especially using bobolinks as sort of a flagship species. And so this certainly does show promise as a conservation tool. I think that, you know, it would be really challenging to think about, you know, raising money for every single species, but thinking about suites of species that you can actually market in such a way to say, hey, if you value, you know, not just grassland birds, or not just bobolinks, but grassland birds in general, it's a way to actually get the public involved. And also, I think, a great way to get outreach to landowners who might just be interested in managing for grassland birds on their own. As I mentioned in 2016, what happened was we had in 2013, 14, and 15, we actually had a grant that was covering all of our indirect costs. So we didn't have any, there was no administrative costs associated with it. Every dollar that was raised went right to the landowners. And in 2016, we transitioned into a collaboration among state level Audubons. So it's Mass Audubon, New Hampshire Audubon, Audubon Vermont, Connecticut Audubon have been involved in it. And it still managed to be sustainable. I think, as you know, in terms of running a nonprofit, some of the money that's pledged has to go into the administration piece, but it's, you know, it's in that nice small range of whatever, 9 to 12% or something like that. So it's great to see that this project can work without having direct grant support. But again, we're still noticing that we're limited by the amount of money we can fundraise. The one thing that, I mean, there's a few things that continue to challenge us. One of them is that we have been paying people to take on these particular bird-friendly practices, but we haven't necessarily asked them to change their behavior. So we've got certain landowners that have been involved in the project for 4 or 5 or 6 years. And one of the things we've been wondering is that enough? Should we say, you know, you could do this on your own now, or is it fine to pay people who are going to manage for grassland birds? And probably, as some of you know, one of the challenges that occurs once you've got a field that's in sort of a late haying rotation for a number of years is you do have some challenges with invasive herbaceous species. So, you know, we have some problems with poison parsnip and bedstraw and some other species that just aren't as good habitat for grassland birds. So one of the things that we're wondering about is whether we should be trying to get folks who are going to change their behavior, or if it's okay to just keep paying for folks who are doing a good job. So this is our webpage, bobolinkproject.com. And as I mentioned, New Hampshire Audubon, Audubon Vermont, Mass Audubon are the ones that are really running the show now. We also have a donation button right here. So if you'd like to go to bobolinkproject.com, you can just click on this donation button and feel free to give money that'll go, again, directly to landowners who are doing good things for grassland birds. So as usual, these types of projects have got a lot of contributors. A lot of the work we've been doing with the Audubon Society has been really great. I have a longtime collaborator at the University of New England, Noah Perlett, who was a graduate student and postdoc, and we continue to collaborate. I think this year is going to be year 19 of our field studies on bobolinks and Savannah sparrows. And we've also got funding from a lot of agencies, as well as funding over the years from University of Vermont, and just hundreds of landowners who have let us do work on their property. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Alan. I know we have a few questions already on the chat page. One was from Lynn Braband. Apart from field harvest, how do wet years impact bird productivity?
I'll go ahead and stop sharing. If I need to throw something up again, I can do that. Yeah, that's a really good question. So generally, it does not affect the birds unless you get torrential rain and some really heavy downpours. Really heavy thunderstorms can either flood nests or just make it really, you have the classic sort of parent-offspring conflict where the parents know that they've got a chance to nest again in another year or maybe later in the season, and the offspring know that this is their one shot. So the adults will give it up if their own survival is at risk with a really heavy rainstorm or even flooding. And sometimes we have seen like a nest on an incline actually get washed down in some really heavy rain. So nesting on the ground is tough.
Yeah. Related to that, from Kevin Carroll, do you think climate change, wetter spring seasons will impact farmers' interest / ability to enroll in the program?
It's a good question. I really, so it's possible, I guess I'll say that. What we've been finding, we've been trying to look a little bit at climate change, and we're not finding any opportunity. The birds don't seem to be responding. Mm-hmm. Farmers, especially if you have a dry year, are cutting much earlier. And in the wet years, generally what happens is farmers may be delayed by, maybe a week or 10 days or something like that, but it's usually not enough time to let those birds, to have those birds fledge successfully. When you get into mid-June, I mean, that's like literally where every day counts, and every day you get another, 2, 3, 4, 5% of the bobolinks fledging per day. But if they put it off from, the 1st of June till the 10th of June or something like that, it's just not enough to make a difference. Yeah.
Also from Lynn, has USDA NRCS expressed any interest in the bobolink project?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually, as part of one of the Farm Bill programs, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP, we actually got the delayed second cut approved as a practice for farmers. So, and they were actually paying $135 an acre for farmers to enroll in that delayed second cut. There were some challenges about the way they implemented it. They said you had to practice it for 5 years and they would pay you for 3 years. So it was good money, but they wouldn't pay. You had to do it for 5 years and they'd only pay you for 3. Mm-hmm. But the challenge that seems to come up with NRCS when I talk to farmers is it just seems really challenging in terms of the paperwork. And there's, basically when we sign a contract with a landowner for the bobolink project, I mean, we literally ship a piece of paper back and forth and that's the end of it. And, we've got, folks like me going out and checking compliance. They've got to do, stuff associated with their income. They've got to have a management plan. They've got to have somebody come out and inspect their property. There's a lot that goes into to working with NRCS, and it's easier for the producers who are already working with them. But if it's a new landowner that wants to get involved, there's a lot that goes into it. So it's a great question and it's challenging. And I think I work with some of the biologists at NRCS, and they know that they have they have some problems with bureaucracy, let's say. And so I'm hoping some change is coming.
Laura asks, what grass compositions work best for bobolinks?
Yeah. To be honest, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. Grass dominated is most important. And basically what you start to see with a succession is you start to see goldenrod and Queen Anne's lace come in, maybe some, even some dogwoods. But if you've got grass, you're fine with bobolinks. They are really not picky about the composition of grass. So, timothy, panic grass, fescue, rye, they're fine with that. So the interesting part, and I guess this is for those of you maybe who are thinking, have maybe gotten a little deeper into grassland bird management, one of the things that has come up in terms of, the idea that is sort of put out there is the concept of an ecological trap, where birds go to places that are not going to be a safe nesting site.
Mm-hmm.
And so in general, there's kind of two different types of grasses. They're what we call early season, cool season grasses and warm season grasses. And generally the warm season grasses are the native species of grasses, and the cool season grasses are mostly European grasses that we've domesticated and cultivated. The cool season grasses green up so much quicker in the spring. Excuse me, they're really what attracts those birds, but they're the ones that are managed most intensively. Mm-hmm. The challenge is the warm season grasses are great if you have a fair amount of acreage of them, but if there's only a little bit, you're not going to get the birds to come in there unless you've got some choices. And I guess I know I think out in the lakeshore, some of the state areas are starting to work with the warm season grasses, and I know that's where I think that's where the Henslow sparrow was a couple of years ago, wasn't it? Out at somewhere near where you all live.
Yeah, out at Burger Park, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, if you're using cool season grasses, it really doesn't matter what the species composition is like. They're definitely generalists.
So William asks, would bobolinks nest if I planted timothy grass and medium red clover in the field in front of my cabin, about 3 acres?
Yeah, 3 acres is a challenge. So the timothy and the clover, fine, but the 3 acres is going to be the challenge. What is? Do you want to put your mic on and tell me what's around your cabin?
William, I don't know where you are on the list here. You can unmute yourself down in the left corner. William Gillette.
Hey, Adam.
Oh, Bill. Hey.
It's my cabin.
Got it.
The field there.
Yeah. I think you've got.
I used to have a lot of bobolinks. When we hate it, I had 50, 60 bobolinks every year here.
Yeah, yeah.
But they've moved since we did corn and soybeans.
Yeah. I think the field by your cabin is going to be too small, but I think, if you could grab a few of the corn on the north side there, I think you could get some bobolinks in there.
Yeah, because we used to have a lot of them, but not. So
yeah.
That's the only piece that they don't rent out. The other one they rent the land out. That's why.
Yeah.
I could get a few sparrows maybe in there, but I don't know if the bobolink, because there's woods all the way around it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
John mentions that he spent a long weekend in Western Massachusetts, and during a long walk in the area, that he found a field with lots of bobolinks and was completely delighted. Is this an ecotourism opportunity for this area here in Rochester, or maybe anywhere?
Mm,
that would maybe supplant or supplement the farmer's income if ecotourism was actually, you know, if it was focused, I guess,
yeah, yeah.
on the bobolink, for example.
Mhm. That's a, it's a really good question. I've kind of thought about it too, because in Vermont, we actually also have something called agritourism, where going around to different farms who are doing different practices, probably just like in New York, a lot of farmers are trying to think about how to diversify and come up with other products, maybe not be so dependent upon, dairy or one particular crop.
Mhm.
So I think the thing that I mean, for most birders, you probably have a place where to go to see a bobolink. I mean, if somebody asks you, where can I see a bobolink, you probably have an answer to that question. So I think it wouldn't really appeal to sort of the hardcore birders, but if you maybe could get that Henslow sparrow or grasshopper sparrow or upland sandpiper, then I think you would attract birders. I think maybe, as you're kind of getting at in that question, the eco tourism, maybe just more broadly trying to understand agricultural practices that are, a little bit more sustainable, maybe, organic, thinking about different types of crops that, maybe are, sort of unique, and, pair it up with taste tests and that sort of thing, in addition to watching bobolinks.
Yeah. Anne mentions we are working to return about 50 acres of agricultural land in Rush to grassland. Do you have any suggestions on how best to do that?
Yeah, is it just coming out of like corn and soy right now?
And if you want to unmute yourself, you can. There you go.
So this is part of a refuge on the Genesee River that has been given to the town of Rush. 50 acres of it is forest, and 50 acres has been farmed by a regional farmer. I'm not sure of the what he's planted, but for about the last 5 years or so, it's been farmed. It was farmland for a long time before that as well. So we are lucky to be able to do something positive with this and take the farming away from it to make it a resource. And the question is how best to do that.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. What is the farmer still in business?
He's in business. He's a local mega farmer who makes lots of money and was just doing this to give some income to our town.
Wow.
And then we realized that it was illegal for the town to do that on parkland. This was given to us for parks. So we got him to stop, and he has been totally positive, supporting us since then, since he realized that this was something that had to happen.
Yeah,
We had woodcock there last spring.
Oh, that's awesome.
First year after we stopped farming it. So we care about woodcocks too.
Yeah. Well, I would say it's a little bit complicated. I wouldn't go out maybe on a limb right now and maybe say anything, but I'll just put my email in the chat, and feel free to send me a message, and I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about it.
Cool. Yeah, Allan has put his email in the chat box, and I can give it to you also if you need it. Okay. Mary Gordon, any studies at Ohio State or other Ohio State universities that you know of? We have set aside 38 acres in Southern Ohio, cut only after July 15th for almost 20 years. Have never seen any studies like yours and haven't asked before either. So do you happen to know any projects like yours in Ohio? She's asking.
Yeah, not off the top of my head, but boy, I mean, Wisconsin has done a ton of work. So I know there's some just a little bit to the north. I don't know. I would take that one via email as well if you want to shoot me that question, and I can see what I can find.
Okay. Mary, please copy down Alan's email. Laura is asking, I wonder how portable your project is to, say, Western New York. Have you tried to include New York researchers, agencies, educators? What kind of champions do you need? Sounds like a lot of people on the ground that that you require for your project.
Yeah, well, we would, I would say if there are folks who might be interested in rolling property into the Bobolink project, feel free to reach out to a landowner, someone who's got property, and all the information is there, both for farmers as well as donors, in terms of being able to make a bid for how much you'd like per acre. And the key for us is really making sure of two things. So we want to have somebody who can go out probably in the mid-June range and count birds. So it could be a whole birding association, let's say, that could get involved with that. And two is just to check at the end of the season for compliance, to make sure they didn't cut before they said they were going to cut. So if there was someone who was, in the, Western New York area that might be interested in getting involved, I think we would just try to, reach out to, a birding association or some volunteers who could go out and just check on that field. I mean, we go out and count birds once, kind of during peak nesting season, and then go out at the end of the year to make sure they didn't cut early.
And are you talking your area? How many people were involved at the very initial part to go out and count birds and knock on doors for the farmers? How many did that actually involve?
So the door-to-door and counting birds, that was one person. You could probably guess who that was. But we did have, we also had a grad student who was involved with some of the publicity side of things, some marketing, getting some press releases out, that sort of thing. But our local news station seemed to really like the Bobolink project, so it was easy for us to get on the news and get the word out that way. And we've got some sort of local ag extension groups that are a nice way to get the word out to the farming community.
Right. And people to count the birds, was that a whole team of people?
No, literally, yeah. No, literally that's me. I mean, basically, we do transects and basically just, sort of walk up and down the field. And we know it's not exact, but we're really counting female bobolinks. Males, the birds are polygynous, so one male might mate with multiple females. So counting males doesn't really tell you a lot. You really want to know how many females are out in the field. So that's what we would do. And basically, you just have to be aware so you're not double counting, and making sure your transects are close enough apart that you're not missing birds.
Let's see. Lynn is suggesting that cooperative extension associations would be great partners in promoting such a program. And Greg mentions that New York could use it now with a loss of Landover incentive program. Greg, you want to unmute yourself and expand on that a little bit?
Lip.
Sure, yeah. I kind of mentioned it earlier on there. So New York had a similar program that was run by the New York State DEC. I spent a little over, well, really about 5 years between working for DEC and actually doing my master's work up in the St. Lawrence Valley, kind of getting up towards your area. The DEC started this as a basically as a statewide program that's similar to the conservation reserve program that's run through the NRCS and USDA. And similarly, they basically were able to pay farmers to allow the DEC or to manage the land, the farmland themselves, under best management practices for grassland birds. And similarly, these were very large fields for the most part, because we know grassland are area sensitive. So long story short, these were 5-year contracts, and most of them ended in 2018, and I think the last 1 or 2 ended in 2019. And it was not renewed, unfortunately. The DEC just did not value it. That's kind of what we got, from a lot of the DEC folks in our grassland bird management working group here in the state. But in our final report, basically, Chris Normant at SUNY Brockport basically did a final report on basically comparing a lot of these different fields. So these landowner incentive program fields on private land versus the DEC state managed lands on WMA's, wildlife management areas. So like Burger Park, out at Iroquois, those sort of things. And basically, long story short, is these private lands were much better. Not saying that the state lands were bad, but the private lands were just better. I mean, there were better numbers. There was greater diversity. They were just really good. I mean, just anecdotally from being out there. I mean, a lot of those. So, many of you in Rochester know that really good field on Hogmeyer Road and Nations Road that has short ears, that was part of the project. We had nesting grasshopper sparrows there every year I did surveys. There were like 12 to 14 singing male grasshopper sparrows on the property at the south end of Nations at 19. So these properties were really good, and it was a big loss to lose these private lands, and a project like this bobolink project is just the ideal thing to come in and be an answer here.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks for that, Greg. It is, I mean, we've just gone to, 1-year contracts. That's something that we're also kind of thinking about, is whether or not it makes sense to do multi-year contracts with certain landowners. But yeah, I put the website for the Bobolink project in the chat as well, if you want to check it out, or if you've got, if you've got landowners that you think might be interested. I'm guessing we're probably not paying as much as landowner incentive program was, but feel free to check it out, or or donate.
Yeah. Great. Any other questions for Allan? I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. We had a huge group.
Hey, I have a question for Allan.
Bill does. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. Down in Rush, that 50 acres that they want to turn into grassland, make sure that they're only using the local grass like Timothy and clover, not switchgrass, because the switchgrass there's hundreds of it down in Montezuma, and there's no birds at all in that. So you really want to use the local. And then what that farmer can do is, after the birds have all left, is mow it so you're not getting weeds and stuff back into it, and bale it up so that it'd be a 2-part win.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, thank you, Bill.
I have a question. If you were to, do you have any recommendations for a really inspiring video that you might show, a video about grassland birds and how beautiful they are and how important they are to the landscape? And if you were to show some sort of educational video that was very inspiring, does anyone have a suggestion for that? Because I've been thinking about this very thing for 20 years, ever since I lived on an old property with bobolinks that I watched get mowed down every year. Until year 4, I finally got enough guts to talk to the farmer. He's like, no problem, I'll delay. So we saw a happy family of bobolinks. Was the most important moment of my life, almost. Okay, maybe it was. But so, yeah, so I just think I always get like, how do you approach a farmer? Because I'm not a farmer type. So I always think that I just don't know. What's the approach, right? They don't want to hear from tree huggers.
It's a really interesting, it's a really interesting point. I'll show, I'll put, you know, I'll put one of my videos in the chat. I've got some other ones as well. But it's, the reactions I get from farmers are so different, and it's really, you know, it's really interesting. I mean, some days when I'm, you know, it's like if I've been out in the field all day and I'm muddy and sweaty, and you know, walk right up to them through their, you know, messy manure pit, they seem to then have no problem talking to me. And if I'm just like going out and have just come from UVM and I've got my teaching clothes on, it seems like it's a different story. So, I mean, I agree. There's a cultural piece there as well.
Mm-hmm. Check out that video.
Good point. Yeah.
I have a quick question too. You had talked about the haying times, and is it sometimes important to hay early in order to keep out some of those invasives and trees, or can it all be done by haying later on in the season?
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, my impression is that if you're haying your fields late every year, that after, I don't know, some number of years, let's say 5 to 7 years, you're going to start to get, I mean, you're almost certainly going to start to get invasives. You probably won't get much in terms of woody species coming in, but you're going to start to get more of those invasive forbs coming in. Again, I'm not exactly sure what's showing up in New York State, but poison parsnip and bedstraw are a couple that show up for us. You know, there's a number of other ones that show up as well. So it seems like at some point you kind of have to sacrifice and do like a mid to late June cut whenever that invasive species is in flower. So you get it before it actually goes to seed. And that's one, you know, one step, especially if you want to try to avoid herbicides. So, some other folks are really, they're working with like goats and using goats as a way to actually control invasives. And apparently goats are highly trainable. I don't know. There's some people I talk to are just totally into goats in terms of controlling invasive species in grasslands. And there's probably some options there. I just don't know that much about it.
If you're not needing the hay for food, and you're in an area that's big enough, you can look at some of the burning practices. They've been very effective at reducing invasives.
That's a great point.
And
Yeah.
Amy, excuse me.
I'm thinking about burning a little area on mine, but I wouldn't want to do it without the fire department's help. Do you know, does anyone know any homeowner who has actually done a burn?
It's a not a quick process. There's a lot of planning that's involved, and whether you're required by law to let your fire department and the police and other people get involved, certainly your neighbors. So it can take up to a year of planning before you just go ahead and do a burn. I've got plenty of examples of either accidental burns or burns that were done by naive, well-meaning people that didn't go the way people wanted. So some planning makes a really good difference, in having an experienced burn crew. And there are places where you can get training to do that, are possible.
Yeah, I'm interested in knowing where to find an experienced burn crew, or if our local fire departments sometimes do that as a training exercise. I've heard that some do.
Yeah, it depends on where you're living. We've been burning fields at Ganondigan, and it took quite a few years to get the state willing to take on doing it, but they've been doing it annually now for the last 5 years, usually about 40 acres at a time. There's about 500 acres of grassland there. So it's been slowly changing in areas from over to the warm grasses, the native grasses. Ironically, the one field that has yet to be burned is the field that's been traditionally the bobolink field. And that's because they don't want to mess something that's working well up.
Yeah. How many bobolinks nest there now?
Last year was such a wacky year, so I never did get the results from our breeding surveys.
On the order of,
Yeah,
5, 10.
5, yeah, somewhere between 5 and 10. And we're hoping that some of the areas that have now gone 5 years since they were burned and are really well established will start being good productive habitat for new areas. In that same field, we also have grasshopper sparrows that are regular breeders. And then every once in a while we get an unusual species like Dixisal one year. And it's a really nice area to, you cannot walk, there's no trails through the middle of the field, but there are walking trails along two edges of the, or the road. So you can look into that field from, fairly safely.
And on the issue of using goats or something, Kevin posted that there's a website called letsgoatbuffalo.com, and that's in the chat right now. And I copied it out so we can maybe include it in our website or something. And Amy, you mentioned that there is an RBA Conservation Committee meeting by Zoom coming up this coming Tuesday at 7 p.m. And
Yeah.
you can contact Amy Kahn for the Zoom link for that.
Anybody who has ever, in the last 3 years, has checked off that they were interested in conservation on their membership form, got an invite. I've heard back, I think we're going to have about 21 people that are going to participate so far out of the 60 so people that got the invite. But if you did not get an invite and are interested, please contact me and I'll be happy to send the link.
Great.
How can we get your contact info?
You want to put that in the chat, Amy?
Yeah, it's on the website. I'm pretty sure it's still on the website, but I'll put it in the chat.
It is under conservation, under.
Okay, thank you.
Sort of about RBA.
Ellen, I had one last question. Is it, product, I know you mentioned kind of productivity and that's kind of one of your metrics for, that you've kind of compared the field to, and I know they're kind of similar metrics, but have you looked into nest success, across the different fields through the different haying regimes?
Yeah, it pretty much mirrors it. If we use daily nest survival rate, it really is pretty similar to that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, they kind of measure similar things.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the difference is predation, and we do get some predation on some of those fields as well. Occasionally more on the late hay fields than on the early hay fields, just because everyone's dying of mowing on an early hay field. So there's really no time for raccoons or skunks to get in there.
Okay. Yeah, I wonder with some of the, I ask because, when if you have a mowing, if the fields are mowed, in May, it's typically really good for, keeping, high grass cover, right? Instead of forbs and shrubs and stuff, well, especially in the cool season fields. But I wonder how, visible some of those nests are to predators, whether they're as well hidden or anything, if there are any predation rates, but sounds like probably negligible.
Yeah, I mean, if for us on those early hay fields, if a nest survives the mowing, it's eaten by predators within 48 hours. I mean, I think we've had one nest ever survive mowing, period. And some of it make it through the mow, but they're gone a day or two later. And I think part of that also is, I think it's somewhat traumatic for the birds. I mean, it's like they're, that where they were nesting is, it's like if you were nesting in a forest and it was clear cut. I mean, it's totally changed, even if you were a ground nester. So,
Right.
yeah.
So if I think I've heard of some farmers who will mark out where the nests are and mow around it. Does that still so traumatic for the birds that they leave anyway?
So yeah, not necessarily. We did a little experiment with this a couple of years ago, and I mean, it was actually it didn't work out all that well because I don't know, the farmer was supposed to cut on X day, and they ended up cutting like 10 days later, and so most of the nests we had marked had fledged already. But I think we still had 3 nests left, and we left these kind of like Volkswagen bug-sized patches around their nests, and 2 of the 3 made it. I think the easier thing to do is if you've got a square field, that the birds are going to avoid those edges, and if you can just pick out a few acres in the center that have most of the bird activity and cut around those, I think you'll do pretty well. And I don't think that provides the exact same sort of cue for predators in turn, like I think over time, the Volkswagen sized patches of grass might be like, all you can eat buffet, come and get it for the raccoons. So, so I think a bigger patch of a few acres could actually do good. And I don't think you necessarily would need someone to go out there and, find specifically where the nests are. You could just say, take this part of the field and that's where all the activity is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good to know.
So if somebody were to have a field that's mainly goldenrod or wildflowers, that's, kind of gone wild for a long time, would you suggest that they do have it hayed at some point in order to maybe entice some of those grasses to grow for these birds?
Yeah, I mean, potentially it's, sometimes it's hard. I mean, the forbs, once they get a hold, it's kind of tough to set succession back unless you burn or do a plow or something like that. So I'd say it's worth a try, but it's hard to know if that's going to, just one cut is going to make that happen. I would say you might need to cut and then actually get in there and plow and do some reseeding.
But the grasses would be better than, say, like the goldenrod and what have
Yes.
you, the birds.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
gotcha.
for sure. Yeah.
And in New York, it's like 2 to 3 years is kind of that max like time frame between mowing. After that, you're really getting to, and in some spots that are wetter and brushier, it's going to be even you really want to mow every year. But yeah, up to about 2 to 3 years in this region at least. Is it kind of similar up in Vermont?
Yeah, we generally say if there's any way you can get out every year, definitely do it. It makes a huge difference. Yeah.
All right, everybody. If there are no more questions, a reminder that next month we are going to have Matt Young talk about winter finches. So winter finches are, I think of them as sort of grassland birds, but I guess their habitat is totally different. Of course, they come in the winter, but they come here in the winter. But our redpolls that we've seen on the East Spit, at least, are all in this sort of, not grass exactly, but some sort of weedy seed producing plants. So, but not in a woody area. So anyway, come next month, March 11th, for Matt's talk on winter finches. And Allan, I want to thank you again so much for your time and information about grassland birds. So
You are very welcome. Great to be here. Great to see everyone.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting.
Thank you, everybody. Hope to see you 1 month from now. See you next month. Have a great night.
Okay, everybody, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that was fantastic. I don't know if we might have set a record. There were 80 people on at one point. There was a lot.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right, nice.
So
Very cool.
Some say too much.
All right.
Actually, Alan, I would appreciate your address, please, for our.
Is it easier to chat it or you just want me to dictate?
No, you can. You can email me or something.
Okay, okay, sure, yep.
And Dave, thanks for joining us, Dave. Good to see you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm
And-
leaving for some chocolate cake.
All right.
Ooh.
I see another Strong is there on the, so if you guys want to have a little family gathering, we can let you do that.
Oh,
Seriously.
Yeah,
We'll critique his program.
yeah.
I see Tom and Cheryl are still hanging on there.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you for logging in.
Great, great to see you, Dad.
Bye.
See that?
Yeah, love you.
Okay, Alan, thanks a lot.
Yeah, you're welcome. Nope, it was fun.
Fantastic, great.
Yep, yep.
I will talk to you by email, I guess.
All right, sounds good.
Thanks.
Have a good night,
Bye,
everybody.
Liz.
Thank you again. Thanks, Alan.
Yeah, yeah, you're
Learned
welcome.
a lot.
Bye, Bob.
you.
Yeah.
Bye, Monica.